am really looking forward to never hearing again, is it going to happen? It is here, it is happening. Thank you.
Hello, Group B would like to thank you for listening to our presentation about the Boston Institute of Contemporary Art and their recent transformation that they underwent in the early 2000s. Today I'm going to begin by talking about the basics. So the Institute of Contemporary Art was facing dwindling attendance rates. On a good year, they'd have about 25,000 people attend the museum. With this in mind, donors were not willing to give nearly as much to the museum as they were in other places. They had to survive on a budget of less than $1 million, which in an area like Boston is only enough to survive and not nearly enough to actually go out to the community like the Institute needed to be doing. There was little public interest because the Institute was found in a poor location. They were actually in an old police station that offered very little space, so they couldn't have a permanent collection or bring in nearly as many exhibits each year as the other institutes were able to do. This offered very little hope for growth. The museum had seen dwindling rates, a smaller budget each year with less and less public interest, so they had no idea really where to go. At this point, they began a search for a new director of the museum and brought on Jill Medvedo. She was then the leader who turned the museum around and allowed for it to grow in the way it has. One of the basic things I want to talk about is just the strategy, culture, and structure of the Institute. It's kind of different to compare it to a for-profit entity because things aren't necessarily as cut and paste as they are in the corporate world. However, Jill treats it as a good business leader would. In the sense she took something that was a low-cost strategy just simply because they had to be. The museum had a budget of less than $1 million, so they couldn't expect to differentiate themselves. However, Jill knew that in order to survive and thrive within the community, she had to make the museum something different than what was offered. That was part of her reasoning for relocating it to the waterfront away from other art galleries. There's also a lot of openness to ideas within the culture itself. Instead of being on a one-track mind, Jill allowed every single person to contribute. This also leads into the structure and the communication, just because all levels, including the public, were included in decision makings. It wasn't just Jill went and made decisions as a director. Instead, she wanted input from every area. To further break down the Institute itself, probably their biggest strength was in bringing Jill on as a leader. She came from a family that was heavily involved in politics as well as lobbying, so she grew up with a lot of connections and at both a personal and a professional level. So when it came to finding big donors, she already had a place to begin. She also had some museum experience, so she was familiar with that environment itself. And also with cost leadership, she knew what she was stepping into, so she could take advantage of all funding that was currently available while also accessing more. The biggest weakness, though, at the time was the museum's funding. With a budget of less than $1 million, that was hardly anything for them to grow the museum. There was also low attendance levels with very little public interest, which didn't look promising in the museum. However, Jill saw a lot of opportunities in this. She was able to completely rebrand the Institute by moving it to a new waterfront location. This offered her to differentiate the Institute from others by making it more as part of the Boston nightlife instead of just something to go and do on an evening. She would then set new foundations that gave growing expectations to the public by involving them in every aspect of the decision making. The biggest threats, however, included other local museums. Many were a lot more established with university connections, including Harvard and Boston College and other high-profile universities with very large donor networks. And then the Boston nightlife was also something that she had to compete with, as it offered a lot of other opportunities that younger crowds might be more interested in. I now want to talk about Jill herself, and especially her big five personality traits, and the three I think were most important to her success. First off, she's very conscientious. She understands what needs to be done and is able to focus on it, and that is what allowed her to drive the museum's growth so much. She knew the tasks at hand, the goals, and what needed to be done, and she was able to bring other people into it. I think a lot of that can be contributed to how extroverted she was. Growing up in a political and lobbying family, she knew how important it was to connect to other people in order to be successful, and she was also very open to the experiences that were brought before her. These three things, I think, more than anything, were what led to the Institute's success. Bringing Jill on as somebody that could connect the local community into a dying trend being art. I think it just shows how important understanding your personality can be.
Boston will soon have a new art museum.
The Institute for Contemporary Art is building a new home right on Fan Pier.
The four-story structure would triple the Institute's exhibit space.
They're hoping to have it built by 2006.
Looks beautiful.
All sounds so simple. We're going to raise the $50 million, unveil a new building, and help transform the landscape and the environment of Boston. We believe that these four firms offer the greatest possibility for the ICA of designing an innovative landmark museum for the 21st century.
Likewise, we have another development in century art, which is an standardized
Our work takes many forms. It's always driven by ideas.
As far as vision goes, Jill really had her eyes set on the waterfront. Her idea was to expand her horizons and the attendees' horizons. And that was kind of her goal for the museum, whether it be the structure itself and the exhibits within it. And so the waterfront played an important role as she wanted to be part of the growth within the community. And she also wanted to include different aspects such as the theater. So it wasn't just static art hanging on the walls. Instead, people could be involved actively on the stage. And she also wanted to keep the community involved through every part of it, including picking the architects for the entire museum. It's a very big decision, and she could have kept it secret, but it was a one of a kind thing where she brought in the public to listen to the architects as well. As far as creation goes, it was a little different for a museum. They were focused on creating a structure itself, and so they began by understanding the community they were in. They saw growth opportunities in Parcel J, which is the waterfront location that was chosen. They were able to recognize a motive to draw people into the museum by differentiating itself from any other museum in the area. And they also understood the necessity to appeal to all their resources, including the public itself being all of the attendees, but they also reach out to local business leaders and local political leaders in order to make the connections necessary to grow funding. And then she also chose to recruit the correct people. It is very important for Jill to bring on people that believed in her vision, or else the museum would go nowhere. When decision making becomes a big deal, Jill focused on collaborating with her peers, both the board members, the other directors, and the community. This public involvement is what set the museum apart from anything else in the area. By including all levels, it increased buy-in, both public interest, buy-in for donors, and so this is what allowed them to be successful, is just the collaboration on every level. Then when it comes to critical decisions, the biggest decision was how to grow this museum, and Jill chose to do so through a new location. This new location would offer them to be a different type of museum entirely. The architects to choose for the museum was another big decision, and their decision-making process here was a lot different than most, by allowing the public to come into a big presentation put on by 4 different architecture firms. She ended up going with the one that was a lot newer, and I think her mindset was brilliant in the sense that she chose to go with an architect that had little experience because they had just as much to gain from the project as the Institute did. The next biggest decision is going to be their leadership and who to choose, because Jill definitely has big shoes to fill. As far as going forward, we think that they're going to need to find people with similar visions in order to grow the Institute. Jill definitely did a good job, and amazing job really, growing it. However, there are now new expectations that weren't there before. We think one of the ways that they can grow the Institute is by bringing in blockbuster exhibits. These are big name exhibits that travel around the nation, around the world, and draw on a lot of people at one time. And I think that'll also bring interest into their permanent collections. And then most importantly, they're going to need to keep the community involved within the projects themselves, because this is what allowed them to be great from the beginning. Overall, we think it was an amazing ordeal. The fact that they went from very little funding to being one of the most competitive museums in the Boston area. And we look forward to hearing more about the Institute of Contemporary Art.
The Institute of Contemporary Art opens its doors for the first time.
It's a 65,000 square foot space where modern art meets the water.
The new ICA is an eye full and an eye opener.